Hi, I'm Miguel. I live in a cozy house in the city with my parents. My mother, Clarice, is an incredible woman, beautiful and full of personality. Sometimes her strong temper can be a bit scary, but she's a good mother. My father, Daniel, is a hardworking and dedicated man. He spends most of his time at work, but always finds a way to provide us with the best. Our home is a place where laughter echoes through the corridors and hugs are warm. We spend our evenings together, sharing stories of the day and planning for the future. Life with my parents is full of love and adventure, and I'm grateful for every moment we spend together. But, as in every family, we also face challenges and obstacles that make us grow and unite us even more. I was playing in the garden, running among the trees and laughing with the birds when my phone rang. The shrill sound interrupted the peace of the room. My mother, who was in the kitchen, quickly left the freshly baked cake on the table and went into the living room to answer it. Curious, I stopped my game and approached the window, watching my mother as she talked. Her lips moved quickly and her forehead was furrowed in concern. From the way she held the phone and the tone of her voice, I could tell that the call was important. "Hi, Mom, what's up?" I called, but she was so focused on the conversation that she barely noticed me. Listening carefully, I realized that she was talking to my grandmother Adelina about my grandfather Joaquim. My mother's expression was a mixture of sadness and worry, and this made me apprehensive. Grandpa Joaquim had been ill for some time, but I hadn't imagined that the situation was so serious. Unable to resist my curiosity, I moved even closer to the living room, trying to catch every word of the conversation. My mother was visibly worried, and I could feel the tension in the air as she continued her conversation on the phone. When she finally hung up, I approached her with a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. "What happened, Mom? Is everything all right with Grandma?" I asked, worried by the somber tone of the conversation I had just witnessed. She sighed deeply, her eyes reflecting a sadness that made my heart clench. "No, Miguel, it's not your grandmother. It's your grandfather," she explained regretfully. "He's getting worse and worse, and the doctors say his days are numbered. We need to visit him tonight, when his father gets home from work." The news hit me like a punch in the gut. My grandfather had always been an important figure in my life, and the thought of losing him was devastating. I swallowed, struggling to contain the emotions that were beginning to rise up. I knew I had to be strong for my family, but it was hard to cope with the news that we might soon lose someone as dear as my grandfather, who taught me to fly a kite and make toys in his time, and we had some incredible times together. I can't wait for my father to arrive so we can go and visit my grandfather. At lunchtime, I couldn't eat properly, which worried my mother, who noticed my distraction. I simply couldn't think of anything else apart from visiting my grandfather. Night fell quickly, and I found myself heading straight for the door, nervously waiting for my father to arrive, anxious to get going. Finally, my father arrives, and when I see him, I'm happy to see him. Without wasting any time, I say, "Dad, we have to visit Grandpa, he's ill," Grandma called to tell us. My father looks at me with a worried and tired look, but nods, "Yes, Miguel, we'll be right there." We quickly set off in the direction of Grandma's house. When we got there, I immediately went in to see my grandfather, who was lying in bed, visibly ill. Suddenly, he asks me to come closer, and I, seeing how frail he was, approach him and hug him affectionately. He looks at me and says, "Miguel, I want you to promise me something. Whatever happens, take care of your grandmother." Without fully understanding, I promptly replied, "Yes, Grandpa, I will. I promise." We drove home and silence filled the interior of the car. That night, at dawn, my grandfather breathed his last and left. My grandmother called our house and I was asleep when she told my parents the sad news. That morning, I woke up not knowing that my life would never be the same again. My parents called me to talk and, as I listened to their words, I felt a deep sadness come over me. I cried copiously, unable to contain the pain of the loss I had just suffered. The days passed with the heavy cloud of my grandfather's loss hanging over us. My grandmother was now alone in her house, and we could feel her loneliness even from a distance. My mother didn't seem enthusiastic about the idea of bringing her to live with us. She feared it would completely change the routine of the house. However, my father, with his compassionate heart, tried to convince her that it was the best thing to do. After many conversations and debates, my mother reluctantly agreed to bring my grandmother to live with us. It felt like a moment of family unity and solidarity, but I couldn't ignore the underlying tension. I didn't know what was coming, but I felt that the family dynamic was about to change drastically. Then came the long-awaited day when my father went to pick up my grandmother. When I arrived at my house, there she was, standing at the gate, holding some old suitcases. Her eyes scanned the house from outside as my father took the rest of the things out of the trunk. I ran towards her, eager to hug her and welcome her, saying, "Come in, Grandma." She looked at me with a small, slightly uncomfortable smile, but agreed to come in. I couldn't help but notice her hesitation, but I still felt immensely happy to see her. My mother didn't take all the commotion in the house very well. She greeted my grandmother with a serious look on her face, without taking much notice. Meanwhile, I took my grandmother by the hand and led her to the guest room, where she settled in. At first, everything seemed fine. My mother continued with her routine, but now with more tasks to do, since there was an extra person in the house. Gradually, this overload began to stress her out. She would mutter her complaints for my grandmother to hear, making it clear that she was uncomfortable with the new situation. The atmosphere at home became tense, and my grandmother could sense my mother's dissatisfaction, which made her consider leaving. My grandmother, although in poor health, couldn't be alone either. She quickly realized that she was not welcomed by her daughter-in-law. The tension between them was palpable, and it made my grandmother feel discouraged and uncomfortable. On the other hand, my father, always patient, did his best to calm my mother down when he noticed her stress rising. However, even with his efforts, the atmosphere in the house became increasingly tense. The house that used to be a place of peace and harmony was now shrouded in constant conflict. I was sleeping peacefully when I was awoken by muffled voices coming from my parents' bedroom. Curious, I got up and went to their bedroom door, which was ajar. I heard my mother venting about how her workload had increased and how the household expenses were weighing on her. She expressed her frustration, saying that she no longer had the time or energy to deal with the extra demands brought on by my grandmother's presence. On the other hand, my father argued that he couldn't just abandon his mother, leaving her alone in a simple house, far from their care. While I was listening to this agonizing discussion, a soft noise coming from the kitchen caught my attention. Curious, I went in and found my grandmother sitting at the table, her eyes downcast and a sad expression on her wrinkled face. She seemed oblivious to the heated discussion going on in the next room, but I knew that her emotions were deeply affected by what she had heard. It was clear that the situation was causing pain not only for my parents, but also for my dear grandmother. I looked into my grandmother's eyes and could see the sadness and resignation in her weary gaze. She said to me in a soft voice full of wisdom, "You know, Miguel, a mother takes care of 10 children, but 10 children don't take care of a mother." Those words penetrated deep into my heart, as if they were sharp points, awakening in me a mixture of compassion and determination. Without hesitation, I replied to my grandmother, "Mom, one day I'll take better care of you, just like I promised Grandpa." My words were sincere, loaded with a promise that I intended to keep at all costs. I looked into her eyes, conveying all the sincerity of my commitment, and in response, my grandmother hugged me tightly, flooding that moment with tenderness and emotion. Her tears wet my skin, and in that embrace, I felt a deep connection with my grandmother and a renewed determination in my heart. The next morning, I woke up with a feeling of excitement in my chest. It was my first day of school after a month-long vacation. I went downstairs, ready to start the day, but something was different. I found my family at the kitchen table, all eating in silence, and I immediately realized that something wasn't right. A heavy atmosphere hung over us, and even the comforting aroma of breakfast couldn't dispel the tension in the air. My mother broke the silence, saying in a forcefully excited voice, "Miguel, have your coffee before you're late. I'm taking you to your first day of school." With a mixture of anxiety and curiosity, I finished my breakfast and rushed to get ready for the big day ahead. Uncertainty loomed in my mind as I got ready, but I was determined to face whatever challenges the first day of school might bring. When I arrived at school, my heart was light and I was excited to meet my classmates again. Lively conversations and laughter filled the corridors, and for a moment, I completely forgot about the heavy atmosphere at home. Meanwhile, at home, a heated argument was about to break out. My mother, upon returning, vented about the dirty dishes and the mess in the house, blaming my grandmother for not helping with the housework. My father, trying to calm things down, intervened in the conversation, but my mother's words cut through the air with a shocking proposal: "Why don't we put your mother in a nursing home? It would be better for all of us." The suggestion took my father by surprise, and his expression of shock and disbelief was evident. The tense and charged atmosphere I had felt when I left the house in the morning suddenly began to make sense. Pain and confusion mixed in my chest as I walked through the school corridors, unaware that a whirlwind of emotions was happening at home. The arguments became intense when suddenly my grandmother stood up and said, "Son, please put me away. I don't want any more fights in the house because of me. Please put me away." My father, his eyes full of tears, couldn't believe what his mother had said, and he couldn't believe that his wife had persuaded his mother-in-law to make this decision, but with great certainty my grandmother said, "I want to be put away in an asylum." A heavy silence filled the room as my grandmother, with a mixture of sadness and determination, made her surprising request. My father, stunned and teary-eyed, tried to process his mother's words, unable to believe what he was hearing. He looked at my mother for support, but found only a resolute and firm gaze. My grandmother repeated her request in a firm and decisive voice, with no room for argument. She was determined to end the fighting at home and find peace, even if it meant giving up her comfort and her home. My father, consumed by emotion, reluctantly agreed to his mother's request. With a lump in his throat, he promised to take care of her and make sure she was comfortable and safe in the nursing home. Tears began to run down my father's face as he hugged my grandmother with affection and sadness. It was a painful and distressing time to say goodbye, but my grandmother was determined to move on. With one last look at my mother, my father made the difficult decision to commit his mother to a nursing home, in the hope that she would finally find the peace she had longed for. That morning I was at school and little did I know that when I got home I wouldn't find my sweet grandmother anymore. It all happened very quickly and my father went in tears to take her to the asylum, not believing that he was doing this against his will. I arrived home that afternoon, carefree and eager to share my day with my grandmother, as I always did. But when I walked through the door, I was greeted by a sepulchral silence and an atmosphere full of sadness. I immediately realized that something was wrong. My mother, her eyes red from crying, was in the living room, but my father was nowhere to be seen. I asked my mother what had happened, but she just shook her head, unable to find the words. It was then that we heard the sound of the door opening. My heart squeezed as I saw my father enter the house, his face marked by pain and anguish. He didn't say a word, but his eyes revealed all the pain he was feeling. With a lump in his throat, he walked over to us and, with a silent gesture, told us the sad news. My grandmother had been taken to the nursing home. Tears started streaming down my mother's face again, while my father simply collapsed on the sofa, completely devastated. It was a moment of pain and despair, where the weight of the decision weighed heavily on our shoulders. My mother tried to approach and console my father, but he ignored her, lost in his own anguish and remorse. That day, our house became an empty place, filled only with painful memories and a deep sense of loss. And I realized, for the first time, how a single decision could change the course of our lives forever. As the days dragged on, the shadow of that episode hung over our family like a dark, oppressive cloud. I couldn't understand how my mother had been able to say those words to my grandmother, and even less how my grandmother had decided to leave for the nursing home. Revolt and sorrow became constant companions in our hearts. My father was never able to forgive my mother for her part in that decision, and their relationship became strained and full of resentment. For me, the situation was even more difficult to deal with. I was just a child at the time, unable to fully comprehend the complexity of the events that unfolded. But I knew, even at my tender age, that I had a promise to keep. My grandfather, on his deathbed, had made me promise to take care of my grandmother. It was a heavy burden for my young shoulders, but I was determined to keep that promise at all costs. I knew I owed him this debt, and I wouldn't rest until I had honored his memory and his last wish. So, even if I couldn't visit my grandmother alone, I found ways to be by his side whenever possible. Whether through letters, phone calls or visits accompanied by my father, I was there, present and devoted to her, as I had promised my grandfather. And so, even as our family continued to struggle with the scars of that dark episode, I strove to bring a ray of light into my grandmother's life, keeping the flame of hope alive in our hearts. The years passed, but the memory of my grandmother continued to resonate deeply in my heart. The relationship between my mother and me remained strained, and I knew I needed to do something to change that, to honor the promise I had made to my grandfather and bring peace to our family. At 18, I decided it was time to act. Determined to give my grandmother the care and love she deserved for the rest of her life, I decided to take her out of the nursing home. I had grown up, studied and finally got my first job. It was time to take responsibility for my grandmother and bring her home. With a heart full of hope and determination, I left the comfort of the family home and went in search of my grandmother. When I arrived at the nursing home, I found her in the garden, where she spent most of her days. With a smile on my lips and tears in my eyes, I approached her and said, "Mom, I've come to get you. Let's go home." She looked at me with a mixture of surprise and happiness, and then, with a nod, she agreed. That day, as we left the nursing home behind, I felt immense happiness and gratitude fill my heart. It was the start of a new journey for both of us, one that I knew would be full of challenges, but also of mutual love and affection. We spent very little time together, as my grandmother was already old and frail. But every moment with her was precious and meaningful. In the days that followed, we shared stories, laughter and tears, creating memories that I will treasure forever. And so, at my grandmother's side, I found the peace and fulfillment that I had been searching for. And even after her departure, her love and wisdom continued to guide me, always reminding me of the importance of keeping my promises and taking care of those we love the most. The moral of this story is that love and care for our loved ones are fundamental values that we must cultivate and preserve. Even in the face of challenges and adversity, it is important to honor our promises and stand by those closest to us, offering support, understanding and dedication. Respect for the elderly and valuing the family are essential pillars for building healthy and meaningful relationships, which bring us happiness and fulfillment throughout our lives.